too. Yeah.
Thank
You can have a giggle at one as well. Do I just start when we're ready, or do I just start when we're ready, or?
You can start.
Yeah.
You can start.
Yeah.
I think it's time.
Okay, good morning everybody. I'm going to start. There might be some late arrivals. This is a French taster session, so if for any reason you think you should be here for brain surgery or anything other than French, you are now in the wrong place. Okay? My name is James Agar. I'm a senior lecturer in the French department here at SELCS. So welcome to UCL, welcome to London, welcome to SELCS, welcome to the French department, welcome to my world. I've been asked to give you a taster of what it's like to study French at UCL. I'm trying not to smile as I say that. Very difficult to do, obviously, in half an hour when you will be studying French for 4 years, 1 year in France, 3 years in London. But the first thing that I wanted to do was to try and explain to you and give a taste for you of what the difference is between a seminar and a lecture. I'm not going to give a lecture today. You will be, I think, probably very relieved to hear. When you go to a lecture, which is a key part of your learning experience, you sit, you watch, you look, and you listen. It's a very passive experience. You might take notes, you might play noughts and crosses, who knows, whatever, but you won't be participating, you won't be active in the learning experience as such. After a lecture, you should have learned something and you should want to learn more. You will need to go away to those quaint places full of books called libraries and read and follow things up and think, well, he said something, I'm not quite sure what he meant, I'll find a book that will explain that. You need to pursue the interests that are introduced to you in outline form in the lecture. Okay? You will have a few lectures in first year in particular when you're studying with us at UCL, and then from first year, starting in first year, but increasingly through second year and certainly in final year, the vast majority of your study in French will be via seminar. Seminars then are different from lectures. In a seminar you would be in a small group, which would be a maximum of 15, 16 students. Okay? So it wouldn't be in a room like this, there wouldn't be rows of seats like that, you wouldn't all be sat in front of me looking at me thinking, I like his shirt. Okay? You would be sat in a circle at desks, it would be more informal, I'd be walking around the room, and you would be talking. Not to each other, well yes to each other, but collectively. You would be engaging, participating, okay? So you turn up for a seminar knowing in advance, broadly speaking, what you are going to be discussing. Because I'll have told you the week before, or it will be on the virtual learning environment, which at UCL is called Moodle, which stands for Modular Object Oriented Distance Learning Environment. Boom. You can forget that. You'll never need to know that again. But every module at UCL has its own learning environment online, where you will find a range of materials, reading stuff, questions, and so on. So that's available to you all the time. So before you go to a seminar, you know, okay, with James next week, we're studying X, I need to read Y, and I need to think about A, B, and C. Okay? And then the 15 of you turn up, we sit down, and we discuss your thoughts. And I will comment on your thoughts, push you a little bit, help you to develop those thoughts, and then you'll discuss it with your colleagues. And you will disagree. And we will debate and discuss and push the learning process forward. Okay? So the seminar, as opposed to the lecture, is interactive, it's participatory, it is not passive. You are actively involved in the learning experience. Okay? Now that's central to what we do at UCL, because what we're trying to do is to engage you to be an active learner. Your own research, your own processes of reflection will be central to your learning experience and your personal development. Those are all good, useful, transferable skills. So the seminar is participatory, you turn up, you're excited about what you're going to be thinking about, and you have things to say. We don't throw punches at each other, it's very civilized, it's like a dinner party without the food, but we have good interest and the wine, we have good discussions. Okay? Now, what you've got in front of you then is something that I use for a final year module that I teach here in the French department. So don't worry, as it were, if you have nothing to say about any of this now, because you wouldn't be expected to. You've not done the preparatory reading. You didn't know in advance what you were supposed to be thinking about. But if you were following this module, this is the kind of thing in week 4, for example, that we might be getting on toward. So, how the seminar would work then, you would know in advance that we were looking at this kind of material. If you look at the handout, you have a picture there on the front of the front cover of a novel. This is a French novel published in 1990. There's the rather battered copy from my office, by a writer called Hervé Guibert. Has anybody heard of Hervé Guibert? Good. So the first thing that you need to know is that when you come to study French at UCL, you will have the opportunity, and particularly in first and second year, you will have to read the great figures of the French canon, mainly dead white men. Okay? So you will be reading some Balzac, you will be reading some Racine, you will be reading some Corneille, some Molière, and so on. From the medieval period through the Renaissance, and then 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century. You will also be studying film, literary theory, and other things like that. You will also, however, particularly toward final year, be studying non-canonical figures. So people that you probably won't have heard of, won't have come into contact with. And Guibert is one of those such figures. You can just take one of those. Thanks. So Guibert was born in 1955 and died, you'll see there the dates at the top of the sheet, 1991, and this book, À l'ami qui ne m'a pas sauvé la vie, a novel, a semi-autobiography, an autobiographical novel, was published in 1990. Guibert was 36 when he died, so he died as a young man. The image on the front of the sheet there, that is Guibert himself. This is a self-portrait he took that's used on the second edition folio imprint of his novel. Guibert was a gay man, and Guibert died of HIV/AIDS. Guibert is not the first French novelist to write about his experience living with HIV/AIDS, but he was the first French writer who became a major cultural figure and whose books became bestsellers in the early 1990s. He'd been publishing since circa 1977. Published author, but didn't have a huge readership. When he wrote this novel, which is about the last 6 months of his life living with HIV/AIDS, it became propelled via the media in France to a very wide public and was very, very heavily read. Subsequent to this novel, he published 3 or 4 other works before he died, and then there were posthumous publications. So this novel, in many ways, set the scene for Guibert as a cultural phenomenon, as a cultural figure of particular importance in France, because he brought to light and brought out into the public a range of debates, problems, issues, which at the time it was felt needed to be urgently addressed to deal with the situation of HIV/AIDS in France. Okay? So in this kind of module, where this kind of novel would be discussed, we are studying literature, but we're also studying literature in particular cultural, social, and political contexts. We're looking at how and to what extent literature shapes and intervenes in public debates which are of real major concern in France at the time. Quite literally, a matter of life and death. Okay? Now, on the front of that sheet, then, you've got the first chapter of Guibert's novel. The novel is 100 chapters long. The chapters are of varying length, but basically they're all fairly short. The longest is only about 4 or 5 pages long. And this is the first chapter in its entirety, 1 paragraph. You can look at it subsequently, but on the back there I've given you the published translation of that first chapter. Below that then, areas for class discussion. This is the kind of thing that you would be thinking about in advance of class so that when you turned up, you had something to say about these bullet points. And we would discuss that either collectively as a group of 16, 17 people, or I would break you up into smaller groups of 3 and 4, give you 10 minutes to discuss something, and then to report back to the plenary. And then student presentations. Not everybody in the French department uses student presentations. I do, so that's why they're on here. Student presentation, slightly different from just a class discussion. This would be where individuals in advance would volunteer entre guillemets,
I will
if they don't volunteer, and through the course of the year, you will all volunteer, you will be volunteered, and you volunteered, and you will take a presentation. So you'll say, okay, James, I really like the look of number 3. I want to go away, think about that for a week, do some digging, follow my nose, do a bit of research, and then I'm going to come to class next week, and I'm going to talk for a minimum of 6 minutes and a maximum of 12 minutes about that topic. Now that's not just to get you to go away and focus your thinking and do some independent research, although it is that. It's also a time for you to organise your thinking and to try and present your thinking in a clear and convincing way to your colleagues. It's not just an occasion where you will stun your colleagues with your erudition such that they'll leave weeping. They might, but it's also a time where you will interest them. You will provoke them. They will want to ask you questions. You will effectively be teaching them, and in their questions, they will be teaching you. And it's through that collective endeavour that the presentation works best and the seminar best functions. Okay? You will probably, hopefully, all think that as individuals you don't know as much as the other people in the room. You will probably, hopefully, think that you don't know as much about this given topic as the person who's teaching you, your tutor. That should be the case. If I know less than you about what I'm teaching you, that's a bit of a problem, okay? But collectively, very quickly, 15 of you collectively have at least as much and maybe more knowledge than do I about the world, life, sexuality, death, dying, bereavement, etc. So it's your collective knowledge in the seminar which we're harnessing and bringing out and learning from each other. Okay, so it's a collective endeavour, even though within that collective endeavour there is independent, individual work that you will be doing. How are we doing for time? Okay, so we're almost halfway through already. Time flies when you're having fun, I'm sure you'll agree. So, a little bit of French context then. I said that this was one of the first books, and certainly the first that became a bestseller, about living with HIV and living with AIDS in the late 1980s, early 1990s in France. Does anybody know what HIV stands for?
Human immunodeficiency virus.
Okay, so gold star there, human immunodeficiency virus. Does anybody know how we say HIV in French?
SIDA.
Not quite. Who said that?
Me.
Okay, thank you, but not quite. We'll come back to why subsequently. You're going to say the same thing. Anyone? Quite often, it's HIV. So in the realm of HIV/AIDS, the Anglo-American world and the English language has strong predominance. Does anybody know, for example, what the Italian word is for AIDS?
AIDS.
AIDS, yeah, exactly. It's the same, okay? I've got a list of different languages. Brazilian Portuguese as opposed to European Portuguese. The word for AIDS? AIDS, okay? So there is a predominance and an over-influence almost, and there are reasons for that which we can trace historically, of the English language. In France, the word for AIDS is different. So although HIV is sometimes transcribed in France and in French as HIV, due to the importance of the English language, it's also transliterated almost into the French language as VIH, VIH. So can anybody work out or translate what VIH would be in French? If you can, just shout it out. You don't have to put your hand up. Those of you smiling have probably got an idea but don't want to say. So what's virus? Virus? Immunodéficitaire humain. Okay, so it's just an absolute translation of HIV and swivel turned round. Virus immunodéficitaire humain. HIV is a virus, it is a retrovirus. Okay, AIDS is not a disease. AIDS is a syndrome. Okay, HIV can lead to AIDS, doesn't necessarily always lead to AIDS, but can. HIV, if it leads to AIDS, is the causative agent of AIDS. But AIDS is different from HIV. HIV can be put under a microscope. You can look at it. It has a cellular structure. It is real. It exists. You cannot literally put AIDS under a microscope. In one sense, AIDS is not real and does not exist. But it does exist, and it is very real in other ways. It's a concoction of language, is AIDS. Anybody know when the term AIDS was introduced or adopted?
about 1980?
Not quite. Yes, circa 83, 84, depends which reference book you look at, but it's the early 80s. HIV was discovered, even though it wasn't then called HIV, in 1981, so you'd have been avant la lettre and before the time had it been 1980. So 1981, discovery of a human-based retrovirus, discovered in Paris and in North America at about the same time, and subsequently it was decided we need to give one name to this virus, let's call it HIV. Particular subcommittee on the taxonomy of the name of viruses decided that. AIDS, as the resultant condition, was decided as the name circa 83, circa 84. There had been other names prior to AIDS, one, for example, which is GRID. So what does AIDS, which is of course an acronym, what does AIDS stand for? Yeah, very good. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So you know where we're going to go now. What about in French? We've already been told, I think, or hinted what it is in French. It's SIDA, le SIDA, S-I-D-A. Okay? So what does le SIDA mean in French? Can anyone give it a go?
Just a definition of the...
Well, yeah, what the individual letters stand for. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, syndrome immunodéficitaire acquis. Okay, so le syndrome immunodéficitaire acquis. VIH, syndrome immunodéficitaire acquis. France, this is not news to you all, is quite close to the UK. Okay, Calais is nearer to London than is Edinburgh. You can get to Lille quicker on a train from London than you can to Manchester, and a better lunch when you get there, entre parenthèses. So France is very close to the UK, Western European, similar sort of population, democracy and so on, rich, developed capitalist economy. Why then do we think from 1981 to 1990, the situation around HIV/AIDS in France was so much worse than it was in the UK? Many more people infected with HIV in France in that decade than was the case in the UK. Anyone any ideas at all? How can we account for the devastation of HIV in France when comparatively in UK the situation didn't turn out to be as bad?
France is way dirtier.
France is way dirtier. Discuss. Not the kind of essay question you'll be answering on this module. Not quite sure what to say in response to that. France is way dirtier. What do you mean by dirtier?
Well, the streets are super narrow and no one picks up everything. There's a bin every meter, but no one just puts everything.
And how would that relate to HIV transmission?
I have absolutely no clue. I don't do
Okay.
So it's a blood-borne virus. You have to have blood-to-blood transfer. So it has to be through a cut. That would be most extreme enough, but usually a body fluid.
Yeah, more sex. So someone had said they had more sex in France. So maybe that would be one thing that would be worth thinking about. And through Guibbert's novel, in which there is quite a lot of sex, we can think about what the French attitudes at this time were to the body, to sexuality, to intimacy, to relationships, and how that might be different, because in a very different context, although very close, geographically, politically, to the UK. Okay? Now, in France, one thing that was very different through the 1980s was the distinction between public and private. Sexuality, traditionally in France, within the Republic, is viewed as being a private issue. Okay? It happens in private, but not just in bedrooms, but behind closed doors, and not just behind closed doors, but we don't talk about it in public. Okay? It's famously known that François Mitterrand, the French president, had various mistresses and loved children. Okay? Everyone in France knew this. Nobody gave a hoot. Nearly said something I shouldn't then on camera. Nobody gave a hoot. Okay? Can you imagine if we discovered that Theresa May, bless her, had a love child? What the Sun would make of that? It would be all over the red tops in the UK. So there is a very different attitude in terms of public and political discourse about sexuality in France, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, than would have been the case and was the case in the UK. In the UK, this time Margaret Thatcher was in power in the 80s, there was which seems almost bizarre now to think back to that time, there was a lot of public discussion about HIV/AIDS. A leaflet went through every door in the country. There was a national TV advertising campaign telling us not to die of ignorance. Those sorts of things did not happen in France until much later, because the realm of sexuality, which at this time was the realm of HIV, was considered to be private, something that we don't talk about. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why the response to HIV in France was, in the beginning, somewhat tardy, somewhat delayed, even though it is the country in which HIV itself was discovered, and the first test for HIV presence in the blood was also discovered and developed, the ELISA test, in France. Other reasons, political cohabitation. What's political cohabitation? Interesting, given the proximity, to think of that in the British context here today, but we won't go there. Anyone know what cohabitation is in France?
Do you have a wife and a lover and you live together?
I like that idea. Sounds a typically sort of French ménage à trois, but that's not, in this context, what cohabitation means. It's a political idea. What do we have in the UK at the moment as a government? Yeah, kind of a coalition, supply and confidence agreement. So in the French context, cohabitation is the situation when you have, for example, a socialist president and a conservative prime minister. Okay? So for long periods of time in the 1980s, we had, elected in 1981, François Mitterrand, a socialist president, and Jacques Chirac, a conservative prime minister. Okay? Different parties, different ideological positions. They can agree, obviously, because they have to, on things like a budget, defence policy, foreign affairs, maybe. But when it comes to things which are controversial, which are particularly sensitive in inverted commas, particularly within the French context, public, private, that we've just been talking about, they will have, probably and did have, very different ideas about how you should, and if you should in public, and with public money, deal with an issue like HIV/AIDS. And it was a lot easier in that context to kick the issue into the long grass, to let it go, to ignore it. Okay? So political stability, which was the situation in France, it's a politically stable country, but built into that stability, cohabitation, also meant that the political climate made it very difficult to fully and in a thoroughgoing fashion address HIV/AIDS at that time in France. Okay? One third complicating factor, which is in a sense built upon the distinction between public and private, particularly around matters sexual in the French context, is the influence and authority of the Catholic Church. Ironically, paradoxically, in France, which is a secular country, the Catholic Church still had a lot of sway and importance, particularly over issues to do with one's private life, issues of private morality, and so on. And that played its part also in tending to keep HIV/AIDS as something which was not publicly discussed. Okay? That situation of a silence, in inverted commas, around HIV/AIDS is shattered periodically by various issues, individuals, and scandals. And Guibbert's novel was a publication which absolutely and forever shattered the silence around HIV/AIDS, because this book, from the first sentence, J'ai eu le sida pendant 3 mois, insistently presents to us an experience of living with AIDS on an individual level, on a national level, and on an international level. And it insists as a novel on the importance and the imperative of speaking publicly, communicating publicly, questioning how we communicate publicly about things which are not just the stuff of literary fiction, but are also the stuff of life and death, the stuff of political structure, the stuff of what it means to live, to be alive, to stay alive in France now in 1989. Okay? About 4 minutes left. So let's just look at the first sentence then. J'ai eu le sida pendant 3 mois. Anybody, any comments at all about that first sentence? J'ai eu le sida pendant 3 mois.
I suppose because of the tense it's written in, you imagine that it was something completed in the past and you no longer has it.
Absolutely. One of the most important things about the first sentence is that it should, grammatically, draw your attention to grammatical tense. Okay? What tense is being used here? J'ai eu. Yeah, the passé composé. And how is the passé composé normally used? We've just been told by our friend. Just repeat what you just said.
Oh yeah, because normally it's a complete action.
Yeah, normally the passé composé indicates completed actions in the past. So what this first sentence does grammatically is to retrospectively throw aids into the past as something which is complete, finished and over. Okay? Even now, but certainly in 1989, that was a lie, a fiction, untrue and impossible. It could not have been over, there was not and no longer and is no, there was not and still isn't now a cure for AIDS. Okay? So our first sentence is an impossible sentence, but it draws our attention to time, to tense. And grammatical tense in the French language and other languages is the structure which is used to construct an understanding in literary fiction, in narrative, of the experience of time. And one of the things that the book does is to try and re-envision on an individual level, on a national level, and internationally in relation to HIV/AIDS, how a relationship to time is fractured, changed, and made different by an experience of a disease that attacks and makes the body at this time waste away. And we know that from the very first sentence. You'll know if you read the second sentence, something else which is marked in the novel and quite often marked in much modern and contemporary French fiction. The second sentence compromises the first sentence. So we have a statement, an affirmation in the first sentence, which is then immediately compromised and qualified. So the certainty of the initial affirmation is then undercut. Meaning then moves, shifts, is deferred, is in the future, and this forces us to keep reading. Okay? Final point then, this novel is also quite a gripping read. It might sound quite depressing, it's also very funny. It might sound very clinical, somebody said, rather insistently, I'm not a scientist. It's also a novel, it's a great read. It is a règlement de compte, it's a whodunit, it's about revenge. It's about those dinner parties where you want to throw wine over the person sat next to you, but you decide you won't do it because I've got a better scheme coming, kind of thing. So it's full of intrigue, really interesting characters, and some of the characters are based on real-life French figures. One, Isabelle Adjani, was furious when this book was published because she recognized that one of the characters in it was really her, which added to the public hullabaloo. Is that a word? I don't know, but I like it. The public hullabaloo when it was actually published. Okay? Any questions before we briefly conclude?
Just one thing. The discussions you have in the class,
Yeah.
the seminar, are they in English?
On this module, they would normally be in English. Yeah. In other modules in the French department, they might be in French. It depends who's teaching, and it depends what materials you are using. And essays, for example, can be written in English or in French. But the materials that you will be reading must be read in French. So content modules, literature modules will be taught in French or English, probably predominantly in English. Language classes are all taught in French. But the materials that you're studying, whether that be film, theory, philosophy, sociology, or literature, have to be read in French. Okay? Yeah.
So if this is a fourth-year module,
Yeah.
how does it compare to what you'd be doing in the first year?
It's more difficult and more challenging and more searching.
It would be the same kind of thing.
Yeah, well, a similar kind of thing, yeah. I mean, you wouldn't be studying Guibert in year 1 and 2. You'd be doing The Dead White Men. You'd be getting an introduction, an overview, a panorama